My name is Don Anderson from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And on behalf of the long list of authors that you see in this paper, I want to give a brief summary of the status of HABs and their trends right now in the United States. This would be covering OBIS regions called East Coast America, the Caribbean, Central America, and West Coast America, but just the portions of those OBIS regions that constitute the United States itself. Now, I'll use this map frequently during this presentation. And in the beginning here, it just shows all of the various HABs and syndromes that affect US marine, coastal, and Great Lakes systems. And you can see that with the exception of Paralytic Shellfish poisoning, or AZP, we have all of the major human poisoning syndromes caused by HABs, as well as a number of others that I'm going to highlight here. In some cases, you can see that, for example, in the northeastern United States and the Northwest, or down here in the Gulf of Mexico and Florida, these regions, these states have multiple HABs that they are dealing with in the same locations in the same times. So let's start with paralytic shellfish toxins, or PSTs. These are probably certainly one of the two most widespread of all the HAB problems in the US. As you can see on the map, they affect the northeast coast of the US, the entire west coast, as well as the parts of Alaska, and with a different species called Pyridinium bahamense, also down in Florida, the tropical or subtropical areas there. So we have Alexandrium catenella affecting much of the country, and a small part of it being affected by Pyridinium as a newly emerging problem. And we also, in recent years, have observed large blooms of Alexandrium catenella above Alaska, up here in the Arctic, potentially as a result of the warming that is going on and the range extension of that organism. Now, in terms of trends, on the left, you see a map of the US showing how frequently PST events have occurred over the last 30 years. And again, you see the same picture: the Northeast, the Northwest, some up here in Alaska, and a little bit here down in the Florida region. But if we put all these together and look at them carefully over the last 30 years using the HADAT data set, you can see that there is no significant national trend in the proportion of US HADAT zones or areas that have had at least one event from 1990 to 2019. So there's no significant trend through time, but you do see significant in your interannual variability in PSTs. Now, ASTs, or amnesic shellfish toxins, are the second most widespread problem in the US. The causative species, there are multiple Pseudonychia species, the most prominent often being Pseudonychia australis. These AST problems occur again in the Northeast, throughout the West Coast, in parts of Alaska, and also in the Gulf of Mexico. This AST problem is considered an emerging HAB problem in the US because it was first discovered or detected in the country in 1991, but it continues to this day and is now established as a problem on both the East and the West Coast, as well as the Gulf Coast as well. In terms of trends, the 30-year map again shows some lower frequency number of events in the Northeast, many of those in the more recent years, and a longer history of more frequent events on the West Coast of the US. And in this case, there is a significantly increasing trend in the zones that have AST events in the country. The next category is diuretic shellfish toxins, or DSTs, caused by 3 different species in the US: Dinophysis ovum, Dinophysis acuminata, and Dinophysis norvegica. You can see this is an emerging HAB toxin in the US, beginning this case in 2008, but continuing to this day. And we have DST problems in the Northeast, in the Pacific Northwest, and somewhat in the central part of the Gulf of Mexico, but we recognize that DST-related illnesses are often underreported and may remain inconspicuous due to the overlapping or the similarity of symptoms with other human diseases and ailments. In terms of trends, you can see a very different kind of 30-year map from the other two I just showed you. Small numbers of events over this interval, but again, most of them in more recent years in the Northeast, in the Gulf of Mexico, and in the Pacific Northwest. And in terms of a statistical analysis, there is no significant trend in the number of HADAT zones that have had DST events since 2008. The fourth major category is neurotoxic shellfish toxins, or NSTs. There's been a long history of NST events in the US, including well back prior to European settlements. And virtually all of these have been within the Gulf of Mexico. There are occasional outbreaks that will occur on the eastern side, the Atlantic side of Florida, and one rare event that occurred up in North Carolina. So NSP is the shellfish poisoning syndrome, but NSTs are also associated frequently with massive wildlife mortalities as well as aerosolized toxin impacts. And in terms of trends, again, the 30-year map shows you that this is centered in the Gulf of Mexico region. And when you look at the 30-year record, you see that there is no significant trend through time in NST events. Now, another important category of HAB that occurs in the US is caused by ciguatera toxins, or CTXs. The causative species are a number of them within the genus Gambierdiscus. They are responsible for ciguatera poisoning following the consumption of fish that have obtained the CTXs through the food web in these coral reef systems. And there's been a long history of ciguatera poisoning events in Hawaii, in the US territories, in the Caribbean, but now we're seeing some appear in the northern Gulf of Mexico and parts of the Florida Keys, potentially as a reflection of ocean warming. But unfortunately, there is not a systematic or routine monitoring program for Gambierdiscus or CTXs in the US. And so there are no time series data on which to establish trends. Another major category, we could just call it wildlife mortality or wildlife toxicoses. Again, there's no systematic reporting of these events nationally. It's much more opportunistic that events get reported. Nevertheless, in several cases, including along the coast of California and in Florida, there are statistically significant increasing trends observed in marine mammal poisonings caused in the California case by the ASTs, and then along the Florida coast, it's the NSTs. Another major problem in the US with HABs is what we call brown tides, as you see here in this image. Two organisms cause these, one called Oreococcus anaphageferens and the other one Oreoumbra lagunensis. And the ones caused by the brown tides caused by Oreococcus used to occur in the Rhode Island area. Those have not recurred, but they have continued over multiple decades in the New York, New Jersey region and have expanded to episodic occurrences in the mid-Atlantic region in Maryland and Virginia, for example. And the other organism, Oreoumbra, causes brown tides that have occurred regularly in Texas since 1990. But they have more recently expanded into lagoons along the east coast of Florida during the last decade. So if we combine all of the different HABs that I've just talked about and even a few more, and when we have HADAT records, that means PSTs, ASTs, DSTs, NSTs, marine mammal mortalities, and some other HAB events, what we get is a statistically significant increasing trend in the proportion of HADAT zones impacted by HAB events through time. So nearly 40 to 45% of all of these HADAT zones around the country have at least one HAB every year. Now, part of this, the way to interpret this would be that the US HAB problem has expanded during this study interval as well as before the 30 years we're looking at. HABs are affecting more regions with more toxins and impacts than was the case decades ago. But part of that expansion is just a reflection of our much better recognition or realization of the true or historic scale of the problem that was long obscured by a lack of monitoring. And a good example of that would be that we have these two new toxins, the Dsts and the Asts, that have emerged within the last several decades, leading to more monitoring around the country and therefore more events. Prior to that, these toxins were undoubtedly present in US waters, but were not being monitored. So to sum this up, at a qualitative level, the US national HAB problem is clearly extensive, far more extensive than was the case many decades ago. We have more toxic species and toxins to monitor, as well as a larger range of impacted resources and areas that are affected. But if we look at just the last 30 years when we have the HADAT data to work with, statistically, we have no significant trends in the PSTs, the NSTs, or the DST events nationally, where there is a statistically significant change in the AST events. Taken together, we do have a significantly increased trends in all HAB events over the 30-year study interval. And as I said, part of this observed expansion is just a better realization of the true nature of the problem. We just now have discovered how big it was. And I would finish here by just pointing out that one result of this, the way we now understand the distribution of HABs around the country, is that many regions of the US now face a daunting diversity of species and toxins that represent a significant growing challenge to resource managers and public health officials in terms of the toxins, the regions, and the time intervals to monitor, manage it, and manage resources. And this does require new approaches to monitoring and management.